stream, and so everything after this should be live.
Great. Good morning, everyone. I'm Mary Jones. I serve as chair of the Marriage and Family Therapy Advisory Committee of the Kansas Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. I ask the members of the advisory committee to respond to roll call to signify their presence in this open meeting that's being conducted remotely by conference call or other electronic means. Jim Kilmartin.
Present.
Nicole Eitzen. John Fleeker.
I'm here.
James Godby.
Here.
Chris Happen.
Present.
Marcy Lichtenberg.
Present.
And Mary, I did see Nicole Eitzen. She is joining the Zoom call right now. So
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I note the following BSRB staff members are also present: David Fye.
Here.
And Leslie Allen.
Here.
Now David will read a message regarding this meeting being conducted remotely.
thank you, Mary. This is David Fye, Executive Director for the Behavioral Sciences Regulatory Board. Public comment allows the public to address the advisory committee about its concerns, but the Kansas Open Meeting Act, or KOMA, does not require the advisory committee to answer questions from individuals. Any individuals requesting to provide public comment could contact the executive director prior to the meeting by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov. There will be no public comment at this meeting as no individuals requested to provide public comment. Because we are conducting this public meeting remotely by conference call and other teleconference ability, I state for the record the following information. Public access to this meeting is being conducted by medium of interactive communication that allows members of the public without cost to attend the meeting through the use of the conference call and on the board's YouTube channel. While the meeting is conducted remotely, the requirements of the KOMA are not suspended, so we'll be conducting this meeting pursuant to the KOMA. On October 28th, 2022, we sent notice of the advisory committee meeting to all individuals who had requested notice of advisory committee meetings. The notice was also posted on the board's website, ksbsrb.ks.gov. You may obtain a copy of the notice at that website. An agenda and other media materials have been posted on the board's website and are available for review. You may also request a copy of the agenda specifically by sending an email to david.fye@ks.gov with the subject line request for the agenda, and it will be sent to you. The notice contains information for the conference call on the YouTube channel that allows members of the public to attend the meeting free of charge. The notice also states that if there are any technical issues during the meeting, you may call the board office at 785-296-3240 or send an email to bsrb@ks.gov. A recording of the meeting will be available on the BSRB YouTube channel following the conclusion of the meeting by using the link to the meeting on the agenda. And I did check the conference call. That line is active. No one was on that before the meeting started, but I'll let you know if anyone joins the conference call.
All right, thank you, Dave. Everyone has the agenda in your packets. If you could refer to that. We'll now go on to the agenda approval. So if everyone has a chance to look at that, if there aren't any other items, I'll take a motion to approve the agenda.
I make a motion. I'll second it.
Okay, thank you very much. All those in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Excellent. We'll get to the first item, which is review of the minutes from the advisory committee meeting from August. I will take these separately because we'll start with that full advisory committee, and then there's two subcommittee meeting minutes in there.
Mary, you said this was for August 12th.
Yes.
I move the approval.
Is there a second?
I'll second.
All those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? Okay, there are two attachments for the subcommittee group who's been working on the supervisory manual. If you could look at those minutes.
And I understand on this, there were 3 members who volunteered to serve on the subcommittee. And so I understand that there's going to be some individuals in this meeting that we're not present for those meetings, but there's no issue if you are comfortable voting on these minutes, you could vote to approve them as well. So.
This is for December 5th, right? I move the approval of the minutes.
I second.
Okay, all those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, and the other meeting minutes?
Yeah, the other subcommittee meeting was from October 4th of 2022.
Thank you. Is there a motion yet?
I move to approve the minutes.
Thank you, Nicole. Is there a second?
I'll second. I second.
Thank you. All those in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed, same sign. Thank you so much for that. David, we'll turn it to you for the executive director's report.
Thank you, Mary. And there have been a couple of meetings of the board since the last time that the advisory committee met. So I wanted to go ahead and provide some updates to you on some recent action by the board, including some items from the October 24th offsite board planning meeting. That's an annual meeting the board has each year in an attempt to go through some topics that have a larger discussion and look at some of the items for the legislative agenda, and then also some updates from the board meeting on November 14th. At the October 24th meeting, we talked about the current process that the agency utilizes to have experts review certain applications. These are usually individuals who have attended a program that is not accredited by the national accrediting body, and we need the assistance of an expert to do some in-depth review of the program and the coursework to determine if they meet the requirements and the regulation for licensure. The difficulty is that when we have several individuals apply who meet this criteria at once, we have tried to contract with experts here in Kansas, but there's a limited number of individuals who can provide that service. And so we were looking at some outside companies to potentially provide that service. There is a company called the Center for Credentialing and Education, CCE, and the board was supportive of exploring that as an option for maybe doing some of these types of reviews to cut down on the amount of time for licensing some of these applicants. And one of the reasons why this is an interesting topic is there are certain states and jurisdictions that require someone to have attended a school that's accredited by the national accrediting body. Kansas offers additional flexibility and provides other pathways for licensure, which I think is a benefit to the individuals applying for licensure here. The problem is that when you have alternative methods like that, it can involve a deeper process. And so it could take additional time. So it's one of those issues that we're working on, but the board was supportive of exploring an agreement potentially with an outside company. So we're looking at whether that needs to go through the RFP process to bring back more information to the board at a later time. Additionally, when individuals apply for licensure, there's a small group that is denied for licensure for not meeting the criteria. Those individuals have the opportunity to request a hearing. In the past, the board had been doing those hearings in front of the full board, but the board recently decided to go to using a hearing panel method where 5 board members would be overseeing those types of hearings. And so the board received some information from legal counsel in terms of what other regulatory boards are using and decided that that would be a good method going forward for some of those hearings. Additionally, there are certain agencies similar to the BSRB in other states and other health-related agencies that utilize something called an impaired provider program. These are programs for professionals that may have an issue with substance use disorder or potentially mental health issues, where those practitioners would be able to seek assistance through a program like this by voluntarily receiving services. Some other states utilize programs like this as an alternative to some of the disciplinary remedies. If there's a situation where an individual has a complaint, and then through the investigation it's determined that there is an interaction between certain behaviors and certain mental health issues or substance use disorders, some jurisdictions use this as one of the possible remedies to have a program like this as an alternative to other forms of discipline. So the board received some information on those types of programs and was supportive of exploring them more. We'll be going through looking at an RFP process for that too, to see what those companies here in Kansas or potentially other states would be able to provide in terms of services like that for the professionals under the BSRB. Additionally, the board had a discussion about licensure requirements and especially license reciprocity requirements. There was a conversation about our general statute on reciprocity, but then also other forms of reciprocity, such as a bill that passed last year that involved expedited licensure for reciprocity applicants for military members, military spouses, and some select other individuals. And so later in the agenda today, the committee will be discussing perhaps other modifications that could be made to the licensure process or to the reciprocity process. Additionally, the board had a discussion about other ways to assist with workforce issues. We talked about that when you look at the current number of licensees under the BSRB, it's really part of a larger equation. Yes, you do have individuals who are coming on board who are starting that process, who are coming in, who have never been licensed before, but you also have individuals who are currently licensed, and the board is exploring ways to support those individuals to help them maintain their license and retain their license. And then we also talked about that there are individuals that for one reason or another have allowed their license to expire. And some of those individuals may have done that because of health concerns for themselves on a temporary nature, or maybe someone close to them, but have stepped away that may wish to re-enter the field. That right now, though, if you wish to reinstate your license, there is double the cost of the regular license fee because there is a reinstatement fee. And additionally, you need to have attained all of the continuing education hours for the prior license period prior to having your license reinstated. So the board explored a new method that would assist with individuals reinstating their licenses more quickly and in an easier manner. The option the board was pursuing is that if someone has had a license that has been expired for over a year, then they would be able to seek reinstatement at half the cost. Currently, you'll be able to reinstate your license. And also you would be able to seek a 6-month temporary license, which would allow you to practice while you are attaining the necessary continuing education hours to have a full license reinstated. And so we think these will be helpful methods to help individuals who wish to re-enter the workforce come back and work as a licensee for the BSRB. So we will be seeking that this spring. Additionally, the board recommended a couple of changes for the behavior analyst profession. One of those was to add a board member to the board for the behavior analyst profession. Currently, statute outlines for the 12 members that serve on the board, and the board does regulate 7 professions, but there is currently not a listed board member for the behavior analyst profession. So the board recommended requesting in legislation adding a 13th member to the board, one that would be for the behavior analyst profession. Also, the board recommended modifying a statute that deals with disciplinary remedies available to the board when a practitioner under the behavior analyst profession may have violated the unprofessional conduct regulations or another statute or regulation. When that profession was added to the BSRB, the language that was used in the statute was different, and the disciplinary remedies do not match the other professions. So this was a way to clean that up and to provide some more fitting disciplinary remedies in case of a violation of those statutes. Additionally, the board was supportive and made a decision to go ahead and seek approval for some new types of temporary licenses for the social work profession. These are individuals who graduate from programs that are in candidacy for accreditation through the Council on Social Work Education. The social work profession has a different process for accreditation, where they utilize a process called candidacy, which can take 3 to 3.5 years to go through. So we do have individuals graduating from programs that are seeking accreditation, that are in candidacy, reaching certain thresholds, but we currently are not able to license some of those individuals now unless they meet other requirements and regulation. With this proposal that we're going to seek from the legislature, we'd be able to offer those individuals a temporary license, and once their programs became fully accredited, they'd be able to get a permanent license. Additionally, the board had a lengthy discussion on continuing education requirements. For most professions under the BSRB, there is a requirement of 3 hours of ethics every license period. And then for those levels of license that are able to diagnose, you have a requirement of 6 hours of diagnosis and treatment. I did some research and brought back to the board a memo that talked about requirements for continuing education for other professions in other states. And while the 3 hours of ethics seems to be a uniform standard between different states and jurisdictions, the 6 hours of diagnosis and treatment is a bit unusual, although other jurisdictions do have other topics that they require for continuing education purposes. And one item the board has been discussing for the past 2 years has been whether there should be a requirement of continuing education in the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion, or cultural competency. And so last year, the licensed psychology profession had requested legislation to make that a requirement for their profession. That did not pass. That was taken out of the bill before the bill passed, but it was proposed by the licensed psychologist. This year, the Social Work Advisory Committee had put forth a request to the board to add a requirement of 3 hours of continuing education in the diversity, equity, and inclusion and cultural competency topic for social workers. The board had a lengthy discussion as far as if that should be something just for the social work profession or if there's merit in making that a requirement across the board for all professions. And it was a decision of the board to go ahead and decrease the current requirement in diagnosis and treatment from 6 hours to 3 hours, and then to add a new requirement of 3 hours of continuing education in the topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion and cultural competency. Now, for the levels of licensure that are not able to diagnose, that currently are required to get 3 hours of ethics, they would have a new requirement of the 3 hours of DEI and cultural competency. And it's important to note, this would not be in addition to the total number of hours for every licensure period. That number is not changing, and that number ranges from 30 to 50 based on the different professions under the board. So the total number of continuing education hours would not change, but within that total, the directed hours would be changing for the individuals who are able to diagnose, and then also for those levels that are not able to diagnose. So currently the ones that can diagnose are required to get 9 hours, 3 in ethics, 6 in diagnosis and treatment. And so they would go to a new system where it would say 3 hours in ethics, 3 hours in diagnosis and treatment, and then 3 hours in the DEI or cultural competency topic. Additionally, the board had a discussion on a requirement and regulation for the professional counseling licensees. There is an educational regulation, KAR 102-3-3A, that outlines if an individual seeking a professional counseling license did not attend a program accredited by their national accrediting body, that is KCREP. For the applicants from non-KCREP programs, there was a requirement that they had to come from a program that was chaired or directed by an identifiable person who held a doctorate degree in counseling. But that regulation also allowed for individuals to have obtained a degree in counseling or a related field. And so what the board determined was that the regulation which required the chair or director to have a degree in counseling should be changed, and it should say that they would either have a doctoral degree in counseling or an other related field, which sort of matches the individuals who might seek the license from that obtain an other related field type degree. The chair could also hold a degree in counseling or an other related field. So that's a modification that'll be going forward in regulation. And then last year and also this year, the board had a discussion on records for deceased practitioners. These are also potentially abandoned records and how the BSRB can be assistive in this process. And so last year, the board had a lengthy discussion about potentially working with the Attorney General's office and their Consumer Protection Division. But the issue is that their division really does not assist with transferring records over to a new custodian, they have a limited scope of when they would seize records, when it just might be a danger for those records to be seen by someone who does not have authority to view those records. And so the board was looking at ways to be helpful in this process. And what the board decided was that as a first step, we would put into the unprofessional conduct regulations for the professions that it would be unprofessional conduct for a practitioner to not have an alternative person named to be the custodian of their records should they pass away unexpectedly or should their records become abandoned. And so we wanted to go ahead and seek that in the unprofessional conduct regulations first to make sure that practitioners knew this was their responsibility to make sure that they had a plan in place for their records. And then after that is put into the unprofessional conduct regulations, then the board would be able to add a question to the renewal application to ask practitioners who the individual was who would be the custodian of their records, should the records become abandoned or should they pass away unexpectedly. Now, for a lot of individuals who work for a large company where the records would be with a company, that would not be an issue. This is mainly going to be for solo practitioners where the records, have the potential to just be abandoned, and there would be a lack of clarity in terms of what would happen to those records. And the BSRB sees situations like this maybe 2 times a year or so, but we want to be helpful in this process, knowing that we do have limited resources to be helpful here at the office. But establishing that as a responsibility of practitioners would be a good first step, and it would highlight this issue to make sure that practitioners are mindful of it and that they put a plan in place for their records. There's also a few items from the board meeting on November 14th I wanted to talk to you about. First, the board did receive information and a presentation on a professional counseling multi-state compact. This compact has been voted on by, I believe, around 18 states so far. So they have reached the threshold necessary for that commission to start meeting. This would be for the clinical level of professional counseling, but it would involve that states that join this multi-state compact would be able to seek privileges to practice in other compact states. And so it would expedite the time for them to go ahead and practice in those other jurisdictions. The board decided that between the November meeting and the January board meeting, members would have the opportunity to research the model language further. And it was discussed that the advocates for that compact would be requesting legislation in the spring. And so the board could have further discussions on that at the January board meeting if the board wished to take a position either in support of the compact or to express any concerns or to have additional discussions on that potential multi-state compact that might be going before the legislature this spring. Additionally, the BSRB is named as an entity, and the board is able to appoint an individual to serve on the Kansas Fights Addiction Grant Review Board. This was from legislation that was passed during the 2021 legislative session, and the board had appointed me to be the board's appointee on that review board, but the board wished to have a more permanent appointee, someone who had experience treating addictions and dealing with the subject matter. And so we had opened that up to all the advisory committees to submit interest if individuals met the qualifications and were interested to serve. And we did have a number of individuals apply for consideration, and we thank everyone for their consideration of that. The board decided to appoint Jason Hess to serve as the board's appointee to that. We're really excited about Jason serving in that role. And I've already connected him to that group, and I believe he attended a meeting maybe last week. So I know he's excited about that opportunity, and I think he will help out the board well as the board's appointee to that group. Additionally, at the November 14th board meeting, the board not only does the licensure for applicants, but also oversees the investigation of complaints against practitioners as well. It's a really important responsibility of the board. There is a subset of the board, the Complaint Review Committee, that really goes through, and we have 2 investigators here at the office who review those complaints and then write up reports, and those are investigated by the board. The work of the CRC, or the Complaint Review Committee, is guided by an investigation policy, and the board has spent a few meetings this fall going through some of the possible changes to that document to update it and make sure that it was up to date. And so the board finalized their changes, and a clean copy with the new changes will be provided to the board at the January board meeting. Additionally, I talked earlier about the board looking at creative ways to help with workforce issues, not just from individuals joining the professions from the beginning, but also for individuals who wish to reinstate their licenses, and then also supporting individuals who are currently licensed to try to help them maintain their licensure if they wish to continue to do so. There is a regulation currently, it's KAR 102-1-15G for the licensed psychology profession that allowed members of that profession, if they were coming to the end of their license period and they had not completed all their necessary continuing education hours, if they could show good cause for needing an extension of time, they could apply to the board for that extension of time. And if they met the criteria, they could be granted additional time to complete their continuing education hours, which would allow them to renew their license and stay licensed. And so we utilized that with several individuals who were licensed psychologists earlier this summer, and we're able to help about 12 individuals maintain their license and get additional time to complete those hours. And so we had brought that to the board and the advisory committees to see if there was support for that. The board was supportive of expanding that to the other professions. And so there are some modifications to that. The length of time would be shortened. The standard would be shortened from good cause or changed from good cause to extenuating circumstances. But we think that will be a helpful way for certain individuals when they're in certain circumstances, that they will be able to make sure that their license is maintained and that they will be able to continue to practice. Additionally, 3 of the professions under the BSRB, addiction counseling, marriage and family therapy, and social work, had brought forward recommendations to the board to remove a requirement and regulation for licensure. The individuals applying for licensure in certain cases had to receive some of their education while being physically present at the school. And the advisory committees had had a discussion on if that requirement to be physically present was still necessary for public protection. And for those 3 professions, addiction counseling, marriage and family therapy, and social work professions, they determined that there was still value in having face-to-face contact with core faculty, but that contact could be either in person or by screen, which would allow more individuals to become licensed to attend online-only schools. And yesterday, there was a meeting of the Professional Counseling Advisory Committee, and they made a similar recommendation that will be forwarded to the board in January to go ahead and remove that requirement of being at the physical presence of the institution. And so those 4 professions will be together on that, which will be a regulation change we will be submitting here shortly. And then 2 legislative updates I wanted to make you aware of. There's a number of proposed regulation changes that have been working their way through the system this year. Leslie Allen and I met with a joint committee on administrative rules and regulations recently and went over all of the proposed changes. They had the opportunity to ask questions. We held an open meeting on the regulations on November 8th. We didn't receive any oral or written comments from the public in terms of any concerns about the proposed regulation changes. So the board did formally adopt those on November 14th. They were published in the Kansas Register on December 1st, and they will become effective on December 16th. And so I will be sending out a email to all licensees just to let them know about those changes and regulations. And then once those have been implemented, we'll be able to move forward with a new set of regulation changes based on the board's actions this year. And additionally, the last comment is that there is a special legislative committee that has met this fall. It is a committee on mental health beds. And at their last meeting, they asked representatives from the Board of Nursing many questions about their licensure process and about addressing workforce issues and whether they are seeking any changes in their processes to make sure that we have sufficient individuals providing services. Well, they expanded that topic and they scheduled a new meeting, which will be held on December 21st. And they have reached out to certain agencies, including the BSRB. So I will be attending that meeting on behalf of the agency, and they will be having some sort of a roundtable discussion and talking with agencies about any methods that are being utilized to address workforce issues. And some of the comments from that meeting, it appears that members of the legislature are very motivated to look at possible changes, but they want to talk to the agencies first to see what the agencies could propose, and then they might consider legislative action during the spring. So I will be talking at that meeting as far as a number of the different topics I addressed today and other work the board has done this year. I know workforce has been a major topic of conversation for the board, and I know the board feels very passionately about it, being to address that issue, while also balancing out, maintaining certain standards as our public protection mission of the board. We have to make sure people are qualified, that they're educated, that they're properly trained. But if there's maybe process changes that we can make or things that are not necessary for the public protection mission of the board. Maybe there can be some flexibility, or maybe we can think outside the box, such as with our conversation about reactivating licenses or helping individuals maintain their license in an easier fashion. So got a lot of comments. I'm not sure how much time I'll be allowed, but I'll definitely be able to speak positively about a lot of the work that the board and all of you have done this year. So with that, I'll end my report and I can stand for any questions.
Yeah, as always, David, you have a very thorough report for this committee. Does anyone have any? Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Chris.
I have two questions, just clarification. I was trying to hear as fast as you were talking. The changes to the continuing ed, reducing the diagnostic requirement down to 3 hours and adding the DEI. When is that going into? I missed when that will be going into effect.
So for most of the professions, that is outlined in the statute. So that is something that would have to go into a bill before the legislature. So they would need to approve that. In terms of the date that that would start, it would probably start no earlier than usually the bills that are passed have an effective date when they're published. So that would probably be July 1st, I would assume. There really hasn't been any conversation about having an implementation date after that point. But that's kind of when most of the legislation would become effective, usually July 1st, following the session when that bill is passed. So the first step would be to go ahead and have the statute modified. And then if there's any additional changes that would need to be put into regulation, those could be identified as well. But the first step would be the statute.
And I would just jump in there and say, you know, that is because it's a legislative process, there is not a guarantee that that change would be accepted. And as was seen last year with the other proposal to add a DEI component, it was stricken from the bill.
Okay. The other question I had is regarding the panel, the hearing panel that's reduced down to 5 members. What would constitute the participation in the 5 panel? Who would serve on that panel?
So the board discussed that. They said that there would be the board member for the profession, and then there would be a public member, and then the other 3 board members could be any board members.
Okay.
With the one exception is that the behavior analyst profession does not currently have a board member for their profession. But for the others, it would be the board member for the profession, and then a public member, and then the other 3 would just be any other 3 board members.
Good. Thank you.
Yeah, and I apologize for the speed, but there's been quite a bit of activity, so I wanted to make sure we had enough time for everything else.
We have had a lot of meetings, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
Well, and it's a credit to all of you. It's a really active board. You guys do, and I've been to conferences and I've seen individuals from other states where they have one profession and they stay very active with just a social work board or just a psychology board. But we operate a composite board with 7 different professions and tiered licensure within those. Not to mention the temporary licenses, the out-of-state temporary permits. And so there's a lot of different topic areas. But I think we're just scratching the surface in terms of all the creative things that we can consider. But I think we're doing some really good work.
I have a question in addition to what Chris was asking. Mary, you mentioned that it was denied, or it was stricken last year. Is there anything that's changing about the language this year in hopes that it will be accepted, or is it the same proposal?
Excellent question. Yes, Dave, I don't know if you want to talk about the language that we're trying to use from the Texas statute.
Yes. So last year there was a question as far as what would it mean to have a continuing education and diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this year during the board's discussion, there was conversation about a requirement in Texas for cultural competency in the DEI category that outlined specific items in that definition. And I apologize, I don't have the definition in front of me, but that's where the conversation was based. And that's what the language the board was supportive of using was the information, the criteria that was involved in that requirement in Texas.
It was a very well-rounded, inclusive definition that I think meets, it doesn't narrow or sort of pigeonhole the scope of DEI, and we thought that that might be a more suitable definition to put forth. Great question. Anything else before we move on? We will dive in a little bit to a couple of these topics just in where I want to get the opinion of the advisory committee for language changes, but please feel free to questions or comments. Okay, I will then move us on into the new business items. And the first one is the discussion of reciprocity requirements for licensure. So this, as Dave mentioned, is really a priority area for the legislature this year. They are really focused on workforce issues and have heard from Kansas constituents that reciprocity is a barrier to the state of Kansas. And so we have had lots of discussion as a board. I've had lots of discussion with local advocacy groups here in my area in Sedgwick County about potential changes to this. And so we wanted to really look at what are the barriers by way of the statutory language. And so you have in your packet KSA 65-6406, which reviews the language that's currently in the statute. And I'll also maybe even, if Leslie, if you don't mind popping in here and talking about a little bit of where the kind of highest level of rub comes with this.
Okay.
When it comes to reciprocity.
So Kansas has, so there's two ways to do reciprocity. One route is that your state has substantially equivalent requirements. Kansas has some high standards in comparison to other states. If the school is not COAMFTE accredited, often their standards don't meet. The second route is that if you have been licensed and practicing for the 4 years immediately prior to when you apply for reciprocity in Kansas, and it's actually 4 out of 4.5 years. So if there's a break-in license for a short period of time, it's okay. And so 4 years obviously is a long time if you're moving or coming to Kansas before then, which then the other bill takes, the other state law takes effect. So sometimes that helps. But if the state law, some of the applicants have not practiced for a year. So that can be a problem too.
Yeah, and what Leslie was talking about in terms of the other state law is what I had referenced earlier in terms of the military bill that passed last year. And what that bill says is that if someone is a military member, military spouse, if they are someone who currently lives in Kansas or they're intending to live in Kansas and they can demonstrate, that is the case, then if they do not qualify for reciprocity under the existing reciprocity statute, then they would be able to qualify for reciprocity if they had practiced for a year in their jurisdiction and they had they have a similar scope of practice in their jurisdiction as well. And then there are a couple other requirements that have to do with lack of disciplinary type activities. And Leslie, were there other significant requirements listed under that? I know most of it has to do with if they have practiced for a year, if they have a similar scope of practice,
Yeah.
and then looking for any kind of red flags such as disciplinary activity that would be concerning in terms of the public protection mission. So
Right.
And I think for this committee to understand too, sort of what happens when someone doesn't have the years or the accredited schooling, then the accredited schooling is really a barrier, because then we have to really identify their coursework and all of those requirements, just like the in-residence thing we talked about. But what happens then is people, if they don't meet the requirements, they have to go through maybe additional coursework. They have to take an examination, which I think become cumbersome and barriers to people. So, my personal opinion, and I want to hear all of yours, is that the 4 years is just not a good standard. In my mind, if you're licensed in Missouri, you should be able to get licensed in the state of Kansas. If you're licensed, particularly in our neighboring states, but really for anywhere, that substantially equivalent is hard because our standards with great foresight were really developed from people who understood the accreditation standards. And so it was like this parallel process that was happening, but it has become so stringent that it's a barrier for people getting licensed here. And I'm hearing from people in my area, it's like, why would I take another exam? I've practiced for X number of years, that kind of thing. So just really wanting to be thoughtful. Leslie, it might be helpful for you to say, what happens when someone doesn't, what does it look like for them when they don't meet, so that this committee has sort of the full understanding of what that means.
If they don't meet reciprocity, their only other option would be to file a standard application. And that gets into the same thing for education. One of the things I've found that seems to be in place in a lot of other states is we require at least 300 hours of direct client contact in practicum, and several other states do not. So if their school didn't do that, they could meet every other requirement, but they wouldn't be approved for a license. And so if they don't meet substantially equivalent, they're really not going to meet standard applications, so they can't get a license in Kansas. And the practicum has to be part of the program, so they can't go back and make that up. They could take a course, but not a practicum. So people are just turned down.
Yeah, thank you for that, because I think it's important for people to understand just like that. If our standards are higher than other states, we could reject a very qualified applicant who maybe has practiced for a very long time,
right, and
can't get licensure in our state. So David, if we're looking at 6406, I know you've had some other recommendations from advisory committees. Is the recommendation to take like section A and not look at timeline, or just talk about having a license, not having disciplinary, so being in good standing? There's also the clinical marriage and family therapy is sort of separate down there, but what are you hearing in terms of that substantially equivalent?
Well, so, one comment I made in terms of the disciplinary activity, there are some jurisdictions that are looking at all requirements for licensure, that are having discussions about, should we change and sort of lower the bar, in my opinion, in terms of conduct of professionals. And I don't know that I would encourage the board or the advisory committee to change anything in terms of meriting the public trust. I think that's still a really important thing, to make sure that individuals who are helping out those that are in vulnerable positions, that we still maintain they merit the public trust. But in terms of the conversation, in terms of how long someone should be practicing in another jurisdiction, I think that's a really good topic for you all to talk about. I do not know that there is a standard that I could point to for other states to kind of tell you, if we have the highest number of years or other. I have reached out to some of the professional associations to get data on that. The problem is, as you might imagine, this is a really popular issue right now. And so there are laws that are being passed every year. So it's a little bit of somewhat spaghetti when you're looking at other states in terms of, new things that are changing, and then things that are replacing existing things or maybe haven't gone into effect yet. So we can't really provide any clear guidance in terms of the time frame, but that is something that you could look at. You could potentially change the amount of time. Also, it does say here that they would have had to practice for 48 of the last 54 months. So if someone had not practiced currently, that is also an issue here too. So someone could have practiced and then had a gap of time and want to become licensed here, but that would also present an issue because they had not practiced recently. So that is something also you could have discussions on.
Two things. Missouri will not consider reciprocity unless you've been licensed for a year. So that's obviously a shorter amount of time. Something that is currently a big problem is people didn't practice during COVID, so they can't meet the 4 years.
So if the word is licensed versus practiced, that might be a change we could consider.
Yes.
Just from the advisory committee, just sort of hearing the overview right now from the members of the committee, what is a sense of wanting to lean into this and make some recommendations?
I think the time, the 4-year requirement is untenable. I think of COVID. I think of maternity and paternity leave. I think of a variety of health reasons and things that just make it very difficult to transfer that. I'm more in favor of keeping the 300-hour practicum requirement, just because I do think that indicates a level of training that's important, but I'm open to influence on that.
I agree with Marcy, and I do like the language of licensed a little bit different as well. I guess I would be curious though, what we would do with an individual that maybe wasn't licensed but coming from another state. Yeah, I don't know, or another jurisdiction. Is that necessary that they were licensed in that?
Yeah.
So yeah,
This is
I like
only,
what Marcy was
that's a
saying.
great distinction, because this is only for the reciprocity piece. So I'm only applying through the channel of I am licensed and want to get licensed in
Mhm.
sort of an easier path.
Okay.
What you're suggesting would be the full application for license, which
Okay.
they could still qualify for. However, because we have pretty high standards, they
Mhm.
may not meet. And that has to do with the accredited schooling, the 300 hours. Those are the things that become barriers for people to come into our workforce for this state.
Mhm.
Then I've also heard a lot of feedback from our border states for sure, Colorado, in particular, Oklahoma, Missouri, where they have people that may be on bridge towns, they're sort of near the border, want clinicians on the other side of the state, on the other state, and they have to be licensed in Kansas, and it becomes, again, yet another barrier for continuing care. So all sorts of
Yeah,
all sorts of
Missouri is one
angles
of
to
the
look at.
states that doesn't have a practicum hour requirement.
Yes.
So I guess, what does, you said Missouri doesn't have the practicum requirement. So what are their standards for reciprocity? Like what would they want to see from somebody coming from another state into Missouri to be able to transfer their license?
Usually with other states, it's that someone met substantially equivalent requirements.
Okay.
And
Ours are
because
higher, so-
because Kansas has high standards,
Yeah,
our candidates don't usually have problems going the
Sure.
other way.
that makes sense. Yeah. Okay.
Chris?
Well, to that point, I was under the impression that Missouri is still required for people to get a license, that you have a practicum of 500 hours.
That, I read that the other day and I didn't find that. I even called, I think, but I'll look it up real quick.
I asked because one of the reasons COAMFTE has reduced the required hours now to 300 in training programs, and because we are and I'm here in Kansas City, to the point that Mary's making, I get asked about reciprocity all the time. And I very much hear your point about wanting to make it as seamless as possible. And we have students in our program who are uncertain whether they're going to practice in Kansas or Missouri. And so it forces a kind of choice. I like a lot the language of changing from practice to licensure. I would think that for those that are even having to determine that, that's an easier distinction to make than it's easier to demonstrate I have a license than I've been practicing. I don't know how you're doing that now, I guess, other than based on, I say I've been practicing. I don't.
That or a supervisor attest.
Yeah.
But people in private practice and they attest it themselves, so.
Right. So we're relying on people to self-report that. I think of the board's responsibility and the regulatory board's responsibility is, to David's point, is the bottom line is to merit the public trust. And I think we're assuming that if a person gets licensed in another state, that there's sufficient training there that if they have an independent license, we're trusting that they have crossed enough hoops that we would trust them here as well. The only thing I would want to make sure is that we're not lowering it to a point that somehow that it becomes attractive to get licensed in another state to come here. So it's almost easier to go get a license there and then transfer to Kansas than to initially pursue your license here, if that makes any sense. So the 4 years is a lot. And I there's a part of me that appreciates a high standard, but when it becomes a barrier to us getting clinicians here who might otherwise, I think that's problematic. But I do like, lowering that or eliminating that and moving it to licensure makes a lot of sense to me.
John, were you gonna say
Yeah,
something?
I've been licensed in Colorado and Utah, and then went to go to Arizona at one time. And Arizona has very different standards than those other places. So they didn't want to recognize the amount of time that I had been practicing in it, or have licensure. So I'm all for, I think licensure makes better sense than practicing as far as language is concerned. I do think that if we're at 300 hours for practicum, I kind of like that, but like you said, we want to make it comparable to what everybody else is doing, but not every state has clinical licenses and other things like that too. So it depends on, I guess, what level we're looking at licensure and all that. So
Yeah, that 300 hours, I think it's an important point for us to talk about, because you could potentially have someone practicing for 10 years in another state and then not be able to be licensed here because their practicum wasn't 300 hours. And so I think when we talk about that, I'm really sensitive to Chris's point about why make it easier for people outside our state to be licensed than within our state. However, our standards are really high, and that is something we could drop in our statute, that 300 hours or regulation. I'm not sure if it's statutory or not, Leslie.
It's a reg.
It's a reg. We could lower that to have sort of a protection there, but not, again, our accredited programs are strong and they're easy peasy to licensure, but I just want you to think about that scenario where they've practiced for a long time but can't get a license here. And as Leslie said, there's no way to go back and get practicum hours because it has to be in the program that you obtained your degree. So these are the unintentional sort of things that happen when you set really strong, nice standards. And so I think there's a few things to really dissect there. I think we're all in favor of the licensed versus practice, and I'd like to have a conversation about the time frame. Is it 1 year? Do we feel like if you're licensed, if you got licensed today in Missouri, could you apply for reciprocity in Kansas tomorrow? Is that, that's a workforce issue, Chris, that I'm sure you see at your area. They want dual licensure immediately because of border.
Right.
I was gonna just say, Chris, you're right that they defer to the COA MFTE accreditation, so it would be 300. It must have been Colorado I was thinking of. I apologize.
I'm wondering, with the year of licensure, I don't know what other states are, and John, you might be able to shed light on this since you've worked in other states, but I wonder what the postgraduate supervision requirements are for MFTs in other places. I don't know if that would be, instead of looking at practicum, is it supervised hours? You know what I mean? Whether that's while you're in your program or post-grad, I don't know, maybe that's silly to look at, but.
It was easy to get licensed in Colorado and Utah because, like I said, we met the standard. It was easy. Arizona is often like California, and Arizona had something like, and this was a few years ago, but it was like you had to practice for like 5 years before they would license you, or you would have to redo your supervision. So I never did get licensed in that state. I was like, oh, nope, not going to happen. But, you know, some states, like California, they have their own licensure exam. And, you know, it's a whole entity by itself. Arizona is kind of like that. I would like to see us, because like with Missouri and Colorado, even Oklahoma, we have a lot of people who kind of go back and forth in different states. I would like to see something comparable of how we can, they have practice in those states, you know, is it easier? I don't know.
Something I would point out about our reciprocity law, when we say substantially equivalent requirements, it's to our LMFT level. So it's only education and exam. We don't look at postgraduate hours. You could change that. And I think now that it's 3,000 hours and 100 hours of supervision, I would think you're more in line with other states' requirements for postgraduate experience now.
That's true.
But I have heard a lot of things about Arizona. They won't accept my hours.
Yeah.
So if we were to look at the 65-6406 and we look at ensuring that we use the terms license versus practice, I'm looking specifically at A. Would we be looking at a recommendation to remove timeframes or lower timeframes? I mean, what are the thoughts there?
What's our time frame now?
Right now it's 48 out of 54 months. So very long time where people have to be practicing.
Yeah, and it's 48 of the last 54 months immediately preceding the application. So
Yes.
even if you had satisfied that in the past, it has to be current.
If you weren't licensed for the last year, you're out.
That's really, yeah. Yeah.
Or if you weren't licensed, yeah, because you only have 6 months, you cannot be licensed.
And I kind of feel like oh, sorry, go ahead, Chris.
Is the time frame, I guess I'm looking, you know, to staff to add, are there times where having that time frame helps us? Am I making sense? I mean, there's a part of it's like, maybe we just take it out and say, if you've been licensed in another state, then that's good enough for us. But I wonder if having even like a minimum of a year would prevent somebody from saying like, oh, I'm going to get licensed in Missouri, and then that's a sort of a backdoor to Kansas. Again, I don't know why a person would do that. But is there a value in having some time frame that I can't see at the moment? Otherwise, I'm like, why have it?
I can. That is a problem for professional counselors, because very few states require their clinical exam, so they can get licensed in almost any state. And if they move to Kansas, and they meet the educational requirements, they can get licensed without taking the exam.
Okay, I'm sorry.
The exam for you guys is more, except California, everyone uses it, so it's not a problem. But yeah, I would say probably if you have at least a year, that would be keep anyone who, you know, did do lower requirements. They would have to practice for a year.
Yeah, I guess my thing is, if we're going to have a time frame, I would recommend 12 months or eliminate it altogether.
I'm certainly on the elimination of it, but you know, I hear your point too. Are there guardrails? Leslie, that brought a question. What are the circumstances in which under reciprocity, someone has to sit for examination? Because this is another key.
If they have to sit for examination, they don't meet the requirements and they have to apply for a standard
Okay,
license
okay.
Through the standard
I've
process.
heard that from people, so I just wanted to clarify.
Although in the past, and it hasn't been brought up for a while, we have accepted California's exam.
I think if I can jump in, what I'm hearing and is that we don't want to make it easier to go somewhere else. I'm thinking of Wisconsin. I know some practitioners who I think they have lower requirements than what Kansas does. So they get clinically licensed in Wisconsin, and then they want to do the reciprocity in Kansas. And I don't know that those coming in with reciprocity, it should be easier for them to do that than it would be to go through the channels of getting licensure in Kansas. I'm thinking of going back to the 300 hours. So if I'm from someplace that doesn't have the 300 hours, or I go to a state, I get licensed, then I come to Kansas, our students are required to have the 300 hours to apply for licensure. So I think it needs to be a similar requirement. And I'm for them. I agree. I think a year would be a good guardrail type of situation, but that's something I would throw.
So going back to what somebody said earlier with that, though, if your program didn't require it, how would you go back? Like, how would you fix that? Like, they wouldn't be able to ever license with us, right?
No.
Well, I can say for people who have come in recently under and they haven't practiced for a year under the KSA 483406 for people who are now residents. They do have the ability to continue practicing telehealth in their previous state. If they hold their license and they practice, they can get that year. They're practicing in that other state. So there are some ways, if they can do that they could make up that year and be licensed.
But not always.
Not always, no.
Not always. And that's the case of people who've been practicing for years and then come to Kansas and can't get licensed.
Right.
I wonder if that's why that year would be a good guardrail. I mean, I was kind of with you at first, Mary, about like what's the value in it, but maybe that would be the guardrail, because then they are practicing at least for a year, which is about how long our internships are, I mean, they're getting some of that practice before coming and practicing here, but yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think my counter, as I've spent a lot of time in this, is back to something Chris has said, that there is sort of this underlying assumption that if you've met a standard in another state, is it a public trust issue at that point? Like, what is our purview? Is it really because we believe 300 hours is better than 250 hours? Or is our bigger global view, the guardrail is you practice in the state of Kansas under the direction of somebody, and there's a complaint review process, and sort of those are the guardrails. So that's my counter to it, is I've really thought about this and just hearing from people, and particularly around workforce issues. I'm on lots of different workforce committees that are talking about this issue. That's my counter to it, is that, who are we to say that, it's the CEU argument. Does 6 hours of ethics or diagnostic and treatment really provide a better clinician than 3 hours? And so, it's just kind of those sort of thoughts. And what is our role? And is it public trust? Then there are guardrails along the way. But, certainly that's personal opinion here. So
something else I might throw out, we have a provisional license for education. If someone's missing a course, they could get approved for an provisional license while they make up the course, and then they could, get the exam and get fully licensed. We could add to the language of the provisional license that if they don't have a year, that they could practice under supervision for a year in Kansas on a provisional license.
Yeah, Leslie, and the piece of that I wasn't sure about
Uh-huh.
when you mentioned that before, was the insurability
yeah.
from credentialing panels on a
Mhm.
provisional license. There's a few that will credential temp licenses that allow people to work,
Mhm.
but I don't believe provisional licenses can be viewed in the same way. But I
Okay.
needed to do some research on that.
Okay.
Chris, go ahead.
I'm only just looking at the language, registration, certification, or licensure. Given that all states now license MFTs, is registration and certification necessary? If it were only licensure, then then can we say, as I think I'm trying to tell myself, can we trust every other state that they're doing something to have a minimal standard? And I have enough faith in other state regulatory boards to say, yes, you're convincing me, Mary. Like, again, I have to keep reminding myself, I think licensure is just about protecting the public to make sure there is a minimal standard. And I'm just asking guardrail questions, really not so much for myself, because I'm trying to make it harder to get into the club, but I also want to make sure that we're serving the regulatory board in terms of its purpose. I could be missing something big, but I'm wondering if registration and certification were not even on there, was this licensure to practice MFT, period, and no disciplinary actions of a serious nature, et cetera. I wonder if that's just sufficient.
I might jump in here just briefly. I think, and I'm not completely familiar, but I think some of that language has been helpful when we've had individuals from other countries that have applied. Some of them, for example, certain jurisdictions in Canada, I'm not sure if they have licensure or if they call it something slightly different, but having registration, certification, or licensure can be helpful, at least with a handful of cases when we have someone come from another jurisdiction, maybe outside the United States.
This is why I ask.
Well, and I don't want to divert the conversation too much. So there's one more comment we really haven't talked about, but I just want you to, I thought I'd mention it just for a second so that you don't have thoughts later on tonight or in a week. Some of the other professions, there's multi-state compacts that are being discussed. And one of the conversations could potentially be, would a multi-state compact for marriage and family therapy settle some of this issue or help us out? And it's possible. A couple of the issues is that I've been trying to follow any work on those compacts, and I haven't heard any concrete work on a marriage and family therapy multi-state compact. So I think there is support from certain individuals on that, but we're still several years away probably from that happening, if there would be one for marriage and family therapy. Also, for the professional counseling multi-state compact, the way that one was written was only for the clinical level. And so if you do have something like that for the marriage and family therapy, where it only dealt with the clinical level of practitioners, it still really wouldn't solve all these issues because it might only affect certain levels of licensure. So just a couple of things to keep in the back of your mind, but didn't want you to walk away from this and think about those things in a week. But so I think, looking at these statutes is probably a really good process for us to go through today, independent of whatever might come down the road in future years.
Yeah, I don't know, Chris, if you have any insight into multi-state compact discussion at a broader level, but I know it's come up a few times prior to your coming onto this advisory committee, just looking out down the road.
I know there's discussion with AMFT, and I know that there's I don't know the details. I know that's part of a conversation.
Okay. So in terms of sort of trying to come with some recommended language that we could bring back to the board meeting as the other advisory committees are sort of wrestling with this too, I think, is there a recommendation that, so we'll keep registration certification for licensure. I was actually thinking of that too, so I'm really glad you brought that up. And this is the time when you're changing a statute to look at the language in total, because sometimes we miss things or there's a typo, right, Dave? But where are we landing with the time frame?
I am less wed to having to have the year that almost just feels like I'm just trying to be protective for some reason. And I think for me, I'm like, if I can say I'm just trust, and the compact thing is a good point. I mean, we're going to have to start trusting other states. And from what I've experienced over the years with our students, most states are relatively similar, to some degree. So I'm, Mary, you make a good point that is, I mean, I don't know that I have to be wed to a time piece at all.
I agree.
Other members? Okay. And then make sure I don't miss any suggestions on this, Dave or Leslie, that we need to be keying into.
Well, so the reciprocity, you have to meet the LMFT level, our LMFT level,
Yes.
or if we're looking at their license, it's an equivalent license. But
Yes.
in our current law, to get the clinical license, you have to show additional items to show. One of them is the exam, 3 years of practice or an attestation from someone who's licensed to diagnose and treat independently. So would you want all of that taken out, or?
Well, that's interesting because not all states have clinical level licensure. So
Right, but most, like LMFT in Missouri, they're allowed to diagnose and treat, so it's still equivalent. Yeah, but I don't know what states don't.
Well, Colorado has LMFT, Utah has LMFT, but you're independent, so you can diagnose and assess at that time. So.
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't want someone who has their license being able to come in and get a clinical license just because. Right. So I think I don't think anyone here would support that thinking. So it looks like the language, you have either coursework or, well, you have to have two of them, the coursework, the 3 years, or an attestation. So 2 of the 3.
Right, the coursework or the exam, that's one. Most people will have the exam. So, I mean, we could take out the 3 years and just say they have to have the exam and an attestation from another person.
Well, and that's sort of a trouble spot for me too, at least again, I get a lot of feedback from constituents about testing when, if they are already at this equivalent independent level of licensure.
Right.
Okay. Then why would we need them to take an exam that says you're qualified to be, that you have the fund of knowledge? So that examination piece, I hear not just in the MFT discipline, but across disciplines as sort of this barrier. And I get it when someone is newly licensed, but if you're already in that clinical level or independent level licensure, why would we need an examination? I'd like to hear from the advisory members on that.
Well, I think if you are in independent, in most states, you've already taken the AMFT exam. So
you've been licensed long enough.
I think we should at least require that for in-state. We should require that for anybody out of state, is they should have taken that exam to be practicing or to have practice, I think. So
they don't have to exam in our state.
Right.
Okay, Leslie, I just wanted to hear that. Okay, I misunderstood what you were saying. Sorry.
No, that just to show that they have taken it.
Oh, okay, yes, all right.
And passed it.
Yeah.
And passed it.
Oh, yeah. That's a good one.
Good clarification.
Language is so important, isn't it?
Yeah.
There are people who have been licensed long enough that they didn't take the AMFT-RB exam.
Yes. So we're really okay with 1 because they would have, in theory, passed an exam if their coursework didn't meet. But everyone really would have to have passed an exam. Okay.
Unless they've been licensed a long time.
And then their coursework could be problematic, maybe. I don't know.
Probably their
If you've
coursework
been
would be-
licensed that long,
You're not going to meet the coursework requirement either.
have you
Probably.
had that?
Yes. Not many.
Yeah.
But psychopathology wasn't as important of a class 20 years ago. So
So those are the people who'd have to take an examination.
they'd
Okay.
have, well, they probably wouldn't meet our requirements, period. Because their education probably wouldn't meet now. You know, what they did 20 years ago probably wouldn't meet current requirements.
Okay. So
So,
we'll try to keep those way outliers out of my thinking here, maybe.
okay.
And then you have to have 2 areas. So you have to have either the 3 years of a clinical experience or the attestation.
hmm
Does that sound reasonable to everyone?
Well,
I think those,
if you do that, then someone who didn't take the exam, if they've been practicing for 20 years, should have the 3 years of clinical experience. So
right,
because it doesn't have to be in the immediate
yeah.
past, it can be at any time during their career.
I think
I-
that sounds reasonable.
Yeah,
Mhm.
I do too. I do too. Anyone else comments on that section?
No.
Okay. So, the educational requirements, if you could go to 10243A attachment.
And Mary, I'm sorry, before we move on from the statute,
Yes,
I was looking at the language of 65-6406, A1, or I guess A2A, that the change in terms of the time frame. So I just wanted to make sure how this would be worded with removing the time frame.
well, could we remove A altogether?
I don't think so, because you would have, well,
I
so
think you would want to remove A1.
because A1 basically says that someone could become licensed through reciprocity if they had substantially similar license requirements. Right, for A1.
Oh, uh-huh.
And then A2 would say, or they could provide information that they had practiced.
When I said remove A, I'm sorry, that was big A.
Okay,
So that was my mistake, not remove little a,
okay,
remove big A. But we could just say registration on big A, registration, certification, or license to practice marriage and family therapy immediately preceding the application.
okay. And Leslie, do you see any issues with that?
No.
Okay.
I do think, just while we're in here and not, I don't even know the exact language. But the way that the lead in is worded, it says that they have currently registered or licensed to practice marriage and family therapy in another jurisdiction. And then they have to meet additional requirements for the clinical license. Some people think that means they don't have to be licensed at the independent level. So we might make that more clear, that if it's an independent, it has to be an equivalent license, not just an MFT license.
So you don't think the little b, applicant for licensure as clinical marriage and family therapist shall additionally demonstrate competence, that doesn't do that for people?
I have had several people, not just in marriage and family therapy,
Okay,
that think that if they have like an LMFT provisional in another state and they've passed the exam, that means they can apply for the clinical level if they show that they meet those other, that they pass the exam and have an attestation that they could get a clinical license.
Do you have a recommendation of what we would add there?
Maybe at an equivalent, a marriage and family therapy license and at an equivalent level or something. Oh, that would be something I'd ask the revisor's office.
Okay, for clarification on that. Is
Yeah.
everyone in this group okay with that? Yeah, okay. Thank
I
you.
will,
Leslie.
I mean, I will admit while we were talking, I think one of the things that's coming into play, I think I had in my head that all along I was thinking LCMFT, but so a person could be licensed in, let's say, Missouri and apply for an LMFT in Kansas.
Mhm.
Yes.
So that's where I'm just looking, I'm not trying to throw a wrench in this. That's why I'm looking back at somebody had in their head, there's a reason for 4 to 5 years. Were they thinking, is this the place where somehow I can get a provisional license of some kind in another state, then move into Kansas and somehow get an easier door to my clinical license? So that's why, I mean, I appreciate having reasonable standards for the LCMFT underneath, to make sure that, again, there's not like a kind of a backdoor way of getting something in place. But I'm sorry, I'm just thinking out loud.
That's okay. That's what we're here to do. And yeah, and then once their LMFT was in place, of course, they were subject to all the
Right.
supervision requirements and
Right,
direction.
okay, yeah.
So when we go back to a little a1 and then or 2, if we're just saying they have to be licensed, then we really don't need the standards are equivalent, because we're saying that license is equivalent, you can come in.
Yes, because that's the next thing, is that educational requirements are substantial equivalency. We're saying we're trusting that the
Mhm.
state that licensed you, that you went through their paces.
Okay.
And we do want to make sure they're discipline free of significant disciplinary issues.
Right.
Under the clinical section, the only concern I have is they just have to have 2 of the areas acceptable to the board. So what if they don't have the 3 years?
They will have had to pass the exam, clinical coursework, that's one. And they would have to have an attestation from another person who's independently licensed. And if someone's newly licensed, they can get that from their clinical supervisor. That's what a lot of people do.
Yeah, would there be any concern that somebody would come in though that hadn't been practicing for very long and try for that, I guess is what I'm wondering.
Yes, so I
Mhm.
mean, this is where language gets a little nerdy for me. So like in Missouri, let's say I get a provisional license, which means all I have to do is take the national exam. And okay, so I have a provisional license. So when I apply, am I saying, well, I'm licensed in Missouri? Okay, so now, and I have the graduate work and I passed the national exam. And if I can get somebody to attest that I can, that I have training to diagnose and treat, I'll go, okay, I guess that's where the independent practice
Yes.
piece is helpful.
Yes.
Thank you for thinking that, because I was suddenly thinking, here's that back door I'm worried about. Okay.
Good discussion. Any other comments? I don't want to move on prematurely. I did tell David, I don't think we'll get through the agenda today because I knew these were going to be very challenging conversations. Anything else? Okay, if you think of something, we can go back to that. I would like to move to 10243A, those educational requirements that have been referenced. So, oh, these are the psychology. I think we actually attached.
Oh, yeah.
one.
My mistake.
That's all right.
I can go ahead and pull those up.
Thank you. You can share them on there.
Yep. Yeah, so it should be 102-5-3. Okay, so you should be 102-5-3.
We have it. Thank you. Thank you for bringing that up.
No problem.
So where this comes into problematic territory, I think Leslie was sort of explaining a little bit here, is the coursework. I'm trying to get to the right place here. We did make changes to the definition of in-residence already, so those are coming. So if you would go down to where we're getting to the bottom of page 1, and we're talking about the
Subsection D.
yeah, subsection D.
Okay.
B, sorry, which is that 300 hours. So again, for refresher, Leslie, don't let me speak out of turn as I've tried to learn from you on this. But then if they don't have those and we're trying to look at their educational requirements, if they're non-accredited, we're looking then at these standards to apply whether or not they meet. And so you're going through those standards and you're thinking, okay, so the didactic coursework is in there, and the one that we butt up against a lot is this 300 total hours of client contact. These are the practicum hours. Again, we are looking at non-accredited programs. So, you know, there are a lot of really good accredited programs, but I've heard this a lot in my time with the board, is that if you're a non-accredited program, then we're subject to these standards and they can really be obstacles for people getting licensure.
So there's a notion that we should remove the 300 total hours or reduce it.
Yeah, I don't know if we should remove it or reduce it to make it make sense, because I think there's a sense from, you know, from this group, I've heard it already today, that there should be some practical application of hours. David or Leslie, do you know in the other disciplines, were there recommendations or thoughts? I know they're not all line by line like ours, so.
Master's level psychology has to have a total 750 hour practicum, but that doesn't mean direct client contact. It doesn't even have a specific number for direct client contact, just for the lower level, the entry level. However, if they don't have that 750 hour practicum, they can do postgraduate work on a temporary license in order to get their full license. Social work doesn't have an hour requirement. Counselors don't have an hour requirement. Addiction counselors do. But theirs is for the lower level, it's the total hour of practicum, and for the clinical, and masters, it's 300 hours of client contact. And then psychology obviously is different. So.
Are you looking for comment?
Yeah, anytime.
My personal view is if it's in those accredited programs, they require that. that should be our minimum standard, I think. It should match. Chris,
I agree. I would really be frustrated if it were less than 300. I mean, just so you know, we're still requiring our students to do 500 in our program. And it seems like, okay, so I guess a student's making a choice, and an argument against myself is what's so magical about 300 or 500 or 250, but I'm in total agreement with John that I would want that to be on par with what a minimal standard would be otherwise.
Is there a way that, because I'm the devil's advocate in this area, is that is there a years of clinical practical experience postgraduate that could be an equivalency here? And again, I'm going to go back to this. I've been licensed in another state practicing 10 years, but I did not go to an accredited university. I have zero way to make that up coming into the state of Kansas. And so I won't get licensed. And is there an equivalency we can think of? Is that rather than a hard no and you're done? Or
Well,
is,
I think the changes you've made, Mary, take that away.
tell me how that would work then.
Because if they're licensed in another state, they don't have to meet substantially equivalent requirements.
Okay. So now this group has to dissect that for a minute, or digest that for a minute rather, or maybe dissect and digest that. Okay, so the statutory change then would take this piece in essence away.
Mm-hmm.
So would this section tell me what that would look like?
So this is just, so the way I understood it, so someone just needs to be licensed, registered, or certified in another state at an equivalent level. And if it's clinical, then they have to show that they meet some competencies. And that would be it.
All right, discussion.
I'm going to throw a wrinkle in there too. So it appears that there could be individuals who may have met the requirements for licensure in another jurisdiction, and then at some point let their license lapse. So if that was the case, then they would not be licensed immediately submitting an application to Kansas. So that's just something to think about.
And they wouldn't qualify for reciprocity anyway, because they're not licensed.
Right.
Yeah, they'd have to do full application.
Right. Yeah. So if it's,
and then be subject to this.
Right.
So to Leslie's point, the changes that we've made, this is kind of moot, but this needs to still be in here, because if I am applying from a non-accredited program for the first time to Kansas, I would want to make sure that they would have a minimal number of hours of 300. I mean, this statute still applies, or this regulation still applies to any applicant, whether they're
a non-reciprocity applicant.
Right. Correct.
Right. So essentially, if someone gets licensed in another state and they only did 200 hours of practicum, they could come in through reciprocity and be licensed without making up anything. However, if they went to that school and then moved to Kansas, they couldn't get a license. I mean, I guess they could.
And that's where,
state, but
yeah, I mean, that's where having high standards is great. And also, if there's not a mechanism, like to Leslie's point on the practicum, there's no way to make up a practicum because with the school that you're in.
Right.
But is there a provision that we would allow them to get licensed, but could make up some postgraduate hours if that's where we landed on it, right? Because I hear the thing.
I would totally be supportive of more of supervised hours being counted in another venue, but having a minimum of 300 hours for a person makes sense to me. It seems fair.
Is it something kind of like what you said, Mary, that maybe they wouldn't be eligible for a full license? I guess I don't understand the provisional license though, too. I guess I would need to know more about that, but would that be more of the route that they would need to go before they could get full licensure, but then you said that there's issues with insurance panels and that kind of stuff. So that may not
Yeah,
be.
their ability to work would be really significantly limited under a provisional license because
Yeah.
there's, from a practical standpoint, they can't bill for services.
That makes sense.
I would support Chris's comments about a supervision, a time of supervised work. If they're under that 200 or under that 300 hours, I would be reluctant to lower that from 300. Just we went to 400 in our program here at K-State a year ago, and the 300 going below 300 would I'm not so sure we'd be protecting the public interest.
Agreed.
I think that's a great compromise in language. What does that look like, Leslie and Dave?
It's, it would be part of the statute first of
Okay.
all. So that, I mean, we're going into the statutes anyway, so that would be, we'd have to add in there or, you know, post however many hours of post-grad work that you would want. And then we would define it in the regulation, kind of lay it out. So you would need to decide how many post-grad hours, if they don't have 300, how many post-grad hours do you want them to finish?
Well, I heard 300. I heard that the minimum is the 300 that we want, so that those would be added to, I hear you correctly, added to their postgraduate supervised experience.
Yeah, the
Well,
deficit amount.
This is different though. This is just for the LMFT. So it would have to be, so they have to have a practicum of 300 hours or they complete 300 post-grad hours. And you could define the supervision the same, or you could do like 1 to 10, like you get in a practicum, because they didn't have the practical experience that you're looking for.
Would that make them eligible for a temporary license?
Yes, if you put it in statute, yes.
Okay, so that makes sense to me then. So not the provisional, it would make them eligible for the temporary, because they're still gonna have to do examination at some point, no, that thing.
Right.
But they would have to complete supervised hours up to that 300.
Mhm.
The
So you
deficit.
just want the deficit?
Mm-hmm.
Is everyone good with that?
Yeah.
Yes.
I know these conversations are always like, and this and that. I mean, I appreciate you all thinking about this. I think it's such good work that we're doing to be thoughtful about this. Okay. Dave and Leslie, those are the points that I think we wanted to cover to take back recommendations, correct?
Mm-hmm. Well, so I guess it went, since you're only doing the deficit, but an LMLP has to do 1,500 hours, but they have a 2-year temporary. So do you feel like the life of the temporary license would need to be extended?
From 1 year?
Mm-hmm.
Well, good point.
You know, we did have a conversation. We started to have a little bit of a conversation about temporary licenses in general recently. And I think in the past, temporary licenses had been lengthier, or at least there had been opportunity to renew those potentially. And right now, most individuals can get a temporary license that lasts a year, and they can only get it once. And so there's been sort of a beginning of a renewed conversation to say, you know, should we change that to allow people to be able to get a temporary license and then renew it for an additional year? So maybe that would be something that could help with that process.
Well, we're talking about the applicant who is coming from an unaccredited program, correct? Who has less than 300 hours. I'm imagining they would have some practicum hours. I'm unaware of, though they may exist, of people who would have an unaccredited degree with 0 practicum hours. That would be shocking to me. But if there were 250, then I think they have 50 hours to make. The 50 hours of their post-grad supervision could count to meet that 300 hours is what I'm thinking.
But it has to be separate because it can't be part of the post-grad supervision because this is just to get the LMFT. So
Okay.
they're not going to be doing
I
their
see.
post-grad
All
yet.
right, okay.
I
Okay,
I think that makes sense, and it's helpful for me to think about. I mean, there may be other benefits to allowing an extension to a temporary license, particularly those for test takers. So I'm
Could
not
that be
opposed.
could that be the one circumstance where we extend the temporary license? Because I know we lowered the temporary license because people were abusing that by staying
Yes.
temporary license forever.
Mhm.
Could that be like a one exception for where you would have an extended TLMFT?
And is
We allow now up to 6 months if there are extenuating circumstances. The temporary license can be extended, but if you look at it as not passing the exam, I don't know if that's really extenuating circumstances.
No.
no, but could these hours, deficient hours, be an extenuating circumstances to Chris's point?
Right.
And I think if it's already there, that there could be a 6-month extension for extenuating circumstances, and we could ensure that this situation is an extenuating circumstance. Then I agree, because I know there's always abuse of things that are done for the right reasons.
Right.
Okay.
So
does
then
everyone
they
think?
would
Go ahead.
help me clarify. They would have 6 months, up to 6 months to get 50 hours of supervised
18.
18.
So the
18.
first temporary license is the 12-month, but it
Right.
will allow
Okay.
them to get a 6-month extension.
Okay, thank you.
So let's
yeah.
say if someone needed 200 of those hours, I mean, I
Right.
don't know what would happen in states to state, but it would provide a pathway.
Okay, thank you. Thanks.
They'd also have to pass the exam during that time.
Right.
Are there, just based on what you said, are there any concerns that someone who's not met educational requirements can then be eligible for the exam? I'm walking down a path and could pass the exam, not have hours, and in our state couldn't get licensed, but okay, that's okay. Just had to go through it. Sorry. Walking through the
I'm with you.
scenarios.
I don't want there to be a loophole that makes it somehow easier.
But I don't think there is. Right, Leslie, it doesn't sound like.
I don't think so.
Or would they not be eligible for the examination until those 300 hours were met?
That's up to you.
Okay, so that's the piece then we're wrestling with here. I couldn't take the exam right out of the gate and not have my hours because I'm not eligible yet to sit for the exam. Okay,
Yes.
we
very
got it.
good.
That's what we want.
Yes.
Okay. Great.
So you want that when the temporary license is approved, they have to show proof of their hours before they can be approved to sit for the exam.
Yes.
Okay.
And I hope that's not very difficult for you to administer. Every time we do these things, I'm like, oh, Leslie, I'm so sorry. But what it is, it's a show of a pathway, right? That ordinarily had been carved out. They couldn't do it. And so it's a good show of the responsiveness of the board to say, let's try to make up something that still has protections in place.
And hopefully this would be for a very small group of people. They
Yes.
could be for the individuals from non-accredited programs, and that also happen to fit this criteria. So hopefully it'll just be a handful of people.
Okay. Other discussion? Okay. The finalization of recommended changes to unprofessional conduct. We've spent some time talking about these.
Yes, so I put together a table, and I went ahead and I sent notes from a couple of past meetings, April and June, I believe. And I'll just I'll share my screen with the table because I think there's just a handful of proposed changes here. So I think there's only about 4. We'll go ahead and walk through these real quick. The first was that there are currently 2 different regulations on unprofessional conduct. There's the main unprofessional conduct regulation, and then separately there was one on unprofessional conduct regarding record keeping. And it was the interest of the advisory committee to go ahead and combine those if there were no issues. And I researched that. It does not appear there have been any issues, and other advisory committees recommended the same thing. So those would go ahead and be combined into the main unprofessional conduct regulations. The second had to do with it being unprofessional conduct if a practitioner was discriminated against any client, student, or supervisee on the basis of race, color, race, gender, religion, national origin, or disability. And that was item number 12 in the regulation. And the advisory committee had recommended adding an additional criteria consistent with the Association of Marriage and Family Therapy standards with the additional phrase "or any other marginalized group." So that was a recommended change. There was some language from a past group of professional counseling advisory committee members that had suggested a couple changes. One of those that was reviewed in this advisory committee was to add a new item that indicated it was unprofessional conduct to practice inappropriate boundaries with clients with regard to use of social media, including but not limited to using a personal profile to connect or communicate with clients on any social media platform, or accessing a client's social media page without previous consent. The other was for it to be unprofessional conduct to disclose confidential information through public social media. And this advisory committee was supportive of including that language for the marriage and family therapy unprofessional conduct regulations. On item 26, there was unprofessional conduct to make sexual advances towards or engage in physical intimacies or sexual activities with or exercising undue influence over any person who within the past 24 months has been one's client. And the advisory committee discussed that. It expressed support for changing from 24 months to a standard where it's never appropriate to have that kind of activity with someone who has been one's client. And advisory committee members recommended including family members of clients under this unprofessional conduct regulation as well. And I just wanted to double check on that one. There was a fair amount of conversation on that for the professional counseling advisory committee. In terms of the movement of 24 months to never, is that also the advisory committee's opinion for family members as well? That it would also fall under never?
I don't remember discussing that part. So did that one come from the counselors group? I don't remember the family members piece. I think that's a definition issue. An immediate family member versus I'm related to someone. I think it's could be a slippery slope in terms of definition. I know I certainly supported the clients just in line with AAMFT standards of conduct.
Yeah.
The family members is a little, I get it. I understand where this is coming from. And yet my concern is just that. Go ahead, someone else, other thoughts?
This is Jim. That was raised yesterday at another committee meeting, that the inclusion of the term family is so broad. And in today's society, I'm not sure anybody can pinpoint exactly where it starts and stops.
I'm betting that though is in line with AMFT. It's trying to be in line with AMFT's ethical code with known family members of the client's family system. That's what's articulated in there.
known family members. Okay, so that I get.
Known members of the client's family system.
So would that
I would-
include cousins?
Known members of the.
Again, that does, to me, in society, I don't know how we define known members as representing the public. The definition of family is becoming very broad. And I like, I can understand families living in the same household. I can understand immediate. But when you just use the general term family representing the public, I don't know where that stops. And if it ever comes before the board, I don't know how I'd rule.
Yeah, when we were teaching ethics in our program here, there was a student that said, suddenly it feels like there's nobody dateable for me in the Kansas City metro area because everybody's 6 degrees of separation from somebody. It's somewhat in jest.
Yeah. So is it the consensus of the advisory committee to remove the language right now concerning family members, but to focus on for someone who's been one's client in terms of a recommended change?
I'm in support of that right now. I think the known family members, which I understand, I think for implementation can also be a troublesome spot. I appreciate those feedback, Jim.
So AMFT will have a quote unquote higher standard that would have to be interpreted. So if you are a member of AMFT only, then you
Yes.
would be bound by that higher standard.
Yeah, and that's to that point, that's one of the reasons I made the recommendation initially about the 24 months, because it seemed
Right.
24 months just doesn't seem reasonable.
Right.
Yeah. What other committee members' thoughts on the known family members? Because I think the way it's written now, I'm not in support of. Is known family members something where you want to take off the table or add?
I'm not sure how it's enforceable, I guess. So if it's known family members, well, I didn't know this was somebody's cousin. I didn't know this was that person. I appreciate the never. I'm totally in support of never having sexual relationships with a client. The family members might be a little stickier.
I agree with Mercy on that.
Yeah, I agree with the never appropriate.
John?
I was trying to, some of these rural areas, we need to make sure we put known. I would never have anything with with a client, but I think 24 months is a good minimum. To kind of align with that, but I think we need to add known immediate family members, maybe, because like you said, family member can be a lot of things. And what if you're dating them and you don't know that they're the relative of this other person? And then.
So it sounds like with the discussion we're having here today, Dave, I think your assessment is correct that we are good with the never and are undecided on the family member. So maybe we should strike that piece, and we can always bring up some regulation changes next year. And see what we want to, if we want to come back and put this up for discussion on a topic, on an agenda item.
Okay. Yeah.
Sound good?
That sounds great. The recommendations or these, regulations had not really been revisited in a few years. And so any kind of updating I think is really beneficial, but we can definitely update them more in the future too. And so the last item on here was no recommendation, but it was discussed by both times. The advisory committee talked about the regulations, and that was possible language on professionals speaking poorly of other professionals. And it was the consensus to allow that to be carried under the ethics for the profession, but not to have a specific unprofessional conduct regulation. So I just wanted to highlight that since it was mentioned in both times the group talked about those. So.
Okay, thank you, Dave. That's really helpful.
May I ask one quick question about the social media one?
Yes.
It might be I'm reflecting my age and my idiocy here, but the notion of or assessing a client's social media page without previous consent. So what that would say that I could not go to Facebook, and if a person had a public Facebook page, that I could not access that. Is that what that would mean? In the same way that like a person who is interviewing for a job, sometimes people will look at their,
Mhm.
I'm not sure I would be supportive of that. If that's the interpretation of that. Because you're telling me I can't go to a public page. Why do I need consent to something that a person is making public? That doesn't make sense to me.
Does the language in there that says to connect or communicate with clarify it? It does for me, but I do understand your process.
Yeah, I mean, if that's, I agree. If it's connect and communicate, I'm totally with it. But it says or assessing a client's social media page. I didn't know if the or was. I just want to assess that page, and so I'm asking that you're right. I agree with you. If it's to connect or communicate, totally with you. If it's like I can't access that page that's public, that seems illogical to me.
I agree, and I have no professional standing.
So it sounds like we have a recommendation to put a period after the platform and remove the accessing a client's social media. Is that consensus of this group? I think that's a great catch, Chris. Actually,
I agree with that because the way our cell phone algorithms work, I have had things pop up from clients just because our phones happen to be in the same building.
Yeah, I agree.
Great change, great catch. Okay.
I know we're running short on time, but that concludes this section.
Yeah.
So
We have so much on this agenda. So I think, but these are the things that we needed to really bring back to the board meeting in January. And as I'm looking at the agenda, I do want to, I know we didn't get to the update on the clinical manual. I do think there's an item that is going to get a lot of discussion very soon, Dave, and that's the crisis regulations. I just want, if you don't mind, I'm going to tee that up really quickly. If you guys can hang on just a minute. I know I also have sort of a hard stop I need to make. This is an interpretation of what does it mean to sort of take care of your clients in after hours emergency situations. And there has been concern brought that just telling your clients they can call 988 is not a high enough standard for caring for your clients after hours. So the discussion among the board up to this point is, first of all, there was an interpretation several years ago that an informal interpretation that said, you're right, just telling your clients to call 988 after hours, at that time it was the crisis center after hours, is not sufficient, but that was an informal interpretation. And now there's been a request to say we need to sort of weigh in and clarify what it means to provide substantial care around after hours crisis for clients. Dave, do you want to add anything real quick to there?
yeah, and I think there's also been, certain instances where a practitioner has said, I'm not available after hours. If you have an emergency, please contact this specific person or this specific group. And so I think that was part of it as well, that, there may need to be some further language to clarify that it would be unprofessional conduct to, assign your patients to somebody else unless you had made a formal arrangement with that person or that group. But then there was also the issue, like you mentioned, as far as, is it sufficient for you to say, in case of emergency, call 911 or call 988, or do you need to have a more structured, specific plan in place in terms of your responsibility after hours?
So I know this particular topic will take a lot of conversation and communication as well. So I sort of am doing this to tee this up for us because we do need to address this on the next advisory committee because it's coming up for the board.
Yeah, and this would be something that could go into the unprofessional conduct regulations. And since some of the other advisory committees are still having conversations on changes to those, it's not something that has to go into the bill for statutory change. But yeah, more conversation on that would be helpful. So.
Okay, great. Well, I know we are over time. Our next meeting would be scheduled, we're trying to stay in the interval of the second Friday of the month, of every other month when possible. And so the next tentative meeting would be February 10th. Dave has provided the suggested dates for what that would look like. I know we don't all know our schedules for next year, but I want to make sure that February 10th works for everyone.
Mary, one last question or statement.
Mhm.
Representing the public, you are all the professionals in this, and I hope you all come up with a coverage solution. In living in Kansas City, I've been exposed over the last 3 weeks to several of the family-related murder-suicides. And I'm sorry to say, it seems, as a member of the public, getting out of hand. And I look for you as the professional group to try to come up with at least an option. And 988, I've talked to people at the communications center, and they're overwhelmed. So thank you for all of your efforts.
Well, thank you for that comment, Jim. And I am so sorry for what's going on in your personal losses there. Okay, well, we'll plan on February 10th as our next meeting. We'll pick up our agenda items where we left off. I know this was a heavy lift today, so I thank you all for your engagement and discussion and conversation. This is great work. It's important work, so thank you for your time and dedication to this, and I'll take a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Thank you.
Happy holidays, everyone, and thank you for all your work this year.
You
Thank
too.
you.